The Prince of Persia franchise has a long and storied history which spans 4 different timelines and 11 games, and that doesn't even include the 4 separate versions of the Forgotten Sands. Yeah, it's a bit of a minefield.
But it is a sumptuous fantasy franchise with a deep well of engaging lore, from the mythical MacGuffins of the Sands of Time through to the Persian mythology inspirations of The Lost Crown. But does it all tie together?
Well, no, not exactly. Instead, we get a franchise that is constantly reinventing itself, tinkering within its own formula to give us something new and fresh each iteration. As a result, I have 4 separate timeline strands to break down. From the origins of the series back in Jordan Mechner's iconic 80s platformer, all the way through to the Metroidvania-like The Lost Crown, via the time-hopping antics of the Sands of Time quadrilogy, of course.
Hey, my name's Adam, and there is no better time than now to dive back into the lore of the Prince of Persia. So join me as I break down and explain the franchise's many timelines. Right, let's start at the very beginning, the 1989 original Prince of Persia, which kickstarts the first continuity on this timeline.
As the game can be completed in less than an hour, or 2 hours if you were playing on the SNES, there's not a whole lot of story to talk about. In short, an evil vizier known as Jafar, not to be confused with the other evil vizier known as Jafar, puts the Sultan's daughter under a time-sensitive spell, where she has to decide whether to marry him or die. The Sultan's daughter has an hour to choose her fate, handily visualised by this nifty hourglass. Hey, are those the sands of time? Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, her only hope comes in the form of her one true love, otherwise known as the Prince of Persia, who's currently slumming it in the Vizier's dungeons. The prince hightails it across 12 levels of increasing complexity en route to the Sultan's daughter, killing the Vizier in the process and dying. Like, a lot.
Yeah, the original Prince of Persia is a hard game, give me a break.
And that's pretty much it for Prince of Persia. You kill the Vizier, save the girl, and waltz off into a happy future as a successful franchise waiting for Ubisoft to come a-sniffing.
Anyway, 11 days later and we reach the events of Prince of Persia: The Shadow and the Flame, which sees everything go to ruin for our poor prince.
Well, things start off good at least, with the prince and princess married in the wake of the prince's heroics in the last game. It all goes sideways from there though. When the Sultan is called away for another war, they never can choose their moments, the prince suddenly takes on the appearance of a beggar and is exiled from Persia. Meanwhile, a doppelganger prince seizes power in Persia and puts the princess under another time-sensitive spell. This one's visualised by a tree slowly wilting, with each falling leaf bringing the princess closer to death. Not to labour the point, but you have exactly one guess as to who's behind all this mischief. Yep, Jafar, who has somehow returned. Anyway, that's pretty much it for your plot in The Shadow and the Flame, as the rest of the game plays out as a greatest hits of the first game, with the prince battling death traps and flying flaming skulls as he works his way back to his betrothed. He gets there via flying carpet, horse, and, flying horse, which eventually brings him back into the path of, well, himself. After eliminating himself, our plucky young couple are reunited, and following his ordeal, the prince takes no chances with Jafar's ashes, scattering them to the wind. But wait, who's that mysterious onlooker teased in the final shot of the game? Surely we'll find out the answer to this tantalising teaser in the next game, right? Well, no, not exactly. The prince's first foray into 3D completely ignores that cliffhanger and sees the newlyweds venture to the Sultan's brother Hassan's kingdom for a little R&R. Only the prince's uncle-in-law, not sure that's even a thing, has different ideas and throws the poor prince in a jail cell. This marriage has been truly cursed for our poor prince. Anyway, Hassan and the Sultan have a little brotherly chat, and Hassan reminds his brother about their vow for their kids to marry, which is a weird vow to make, but whatever.
It would be most advantageous for you to honor our agreement.
Hassan threatens to kill the Sultan if his son Ragnar doesn't marry the princess, and we have the plot catalyst for a new game. Just to add a little spice into the mix here, Ragnar is half human, half tiger, which makes the brothers' vow weirder still. Naturally, the prince escapes his jail time and immediately makes his way back to the party he was rudely thrown out of at the beginning of the game. Instead, he finds his father-in-law, who implores him to divorce his daughter, which isn't exactly the conversation you want to be having so soon after your wedding day. Hassan then makes a move to to kill the prince but accidentally ends up killing his own brother, and this absolute mess of a scenario ends with the Sultan asking the prince to save his daughter from marrying a tiger. Said tiger Ragnar then kidnaps the princess, forcing the prince into action. Naturally, the princess doesn't want to change her marital status, and so Ragnar decides to kill her, as that's the next best thing, I guess. The prince steps in just at the right moment, kills Ragnar in his own big bloody machine, before saving the princess and flying off on a winged horse to a happier reboot.
Okay, this timeline's about to get funky with the first of 3 separate reboots, the first being the Sands of Time continuity.
Forget everything you knew about the prince, this is an entirely new timeline and/or dimension, and as a result we're starting completely afresh. The Sands of Time is set in the 9th century AD, and sees the titular prince narrating his epic tale to an unseen listener. Don't worry, all will be revealed in time. As a side note, this narration offers up some unique commentary on the gameplay, such as the prince's sassy comments on your performance.
Wait, that's not right. I didn't fall. Let me start again.
Anyway, the prince and his father are en route to visiting the Sultan of Azad, but are tempted into attacking a walled city in India by a clearly evil vizier. During the siege, the vizier surrenders to the invading Persians and reveals that there's a hidden treasure vault located within. The headstrong prince pushes forward to cement his honour to his father, and eventually comes across a mysterious artifact known as the Dagger of Time. After some nifty acrobatics, he nabs the shiny blade and presents it to his father.
Father, I have brought us honor and glory.
Much to the ire of the vizier, who was angling for it himself. Anyway, along with the spoils of war, which include a host of exotic animals, some hostages, and a great big bloody hourglass, the Persians return to Azad and gift them all to the Sultan. The Sultan clocks the giant hourglass because it's kind of an eye-opener, and the vizier reveals that it houses the fabled Sands of Time, a sight no mortal man has ever seen. And with that tantalising tease, he persuades the prince to unlock the hourglass with his new dagger, against the wishes of one of the onlooking hostages, a woman named Farah, who will come to be quite important across this branch of the timeline. The prince stabs the hourglass and the sands of time pour forth, turning all and sundry into hideous sand zombies. The only people to survive the sandstorm are the vizier, the prince, and Farah, and so begins the Sands of Time. The prince escapes from the vizier and eventually teams up with Farah, who seems to know more than she's letting on about the hourglass and the sands themselves. The pair reluctantly agree to team up despite an obvious air of mistrust emanating between them. As they journey through the nightmarish towers and tombs of Azad, their relationship starts to thaw, and the pair eventually fall in love en route to the hourglass. Only the prince still has his doubts about Farah as a result of the visions he keeps seeing, which show him Farah betraying him by stealing the dagger. It's this doubt that stops the prince immediately fixing things when the pair get back to the hourglass, and in this moment of indecision he's ambushed by the vizier, which forces them to escape once again. After getting away from the vizier by the skin of their teeth, the prince and Farah find themselves deep within the tombs of Azad, where Farah recounts a personal story about her childhood, a story that will become important later on, just wait.
Why didn't you trust me?
The pair eventually escape the tombs and make their way to the bathhouses where Farah seduces the prince and the pair have a steamy night together. The morning after is not so happy for the prince though, as he awakes to find that Farah has actually stolen the dagger. The prince chases after Farah and eventually catches up to her as she makes it back to the hourglass. The pair are ambushed again by a platoon of sand zombies and they both fall off the edge of the tower. And with the weight of both of them threatening to take them both down to the abyss, Farah sacrifices herself so that the prince can survive. The prince's morning is interrupted by the treacherous vizier, who once again makes a move for the dagger.
Eternal life will be yours.
I choose death.
But the prince instead stabs the dagger deep into the hourglass, which immediately rewinds time right back to the beginning. I'm not entirely convinced he knew that was going to happen, but hey, desperate times and all that. Anyway, we find ourselves right back at the beginning, which basically means that all of the previous hasn't technically happened. Albeit the prince still has the dagger and crucially all of his memories. To put a stop to the same fate coming to pass, the prince sneaks into Farah's chambers back in her walled city in India and starts telling her his outlandish tale. And this brings us full circle back to his narration, as it's Farah that the prince is talking to during his commentary. The vizier, always one for an ambush, makes an unwelcome entrance just as the prince is finishing up his story. Sick of his bullshit, the prince straight up murders the vizier in front of a bewildered Farah, and then has the balls to kiss Farah, a move that she rightly denies. The prince then uses the dagger one last time to rewind back to before the kiss.
Such a fantastic story.
And then he returns the blade to Farah. but just before he leaves, the prince regales Farah's personal story from her childhood, which shocks Farah to her core, as it basically gives credence to the prince's story after all. And with that, the Sands of Time comes to a close.
Right, before we crash on into the emo warrior within, we've got a date with all 4 versions of the Forgotten Sands, which slots into the timeline here in the 7-year gap between the Sands of Time and its sequel.
Yep, you heard me right a second ago, there are 4 unique versions of the Forgotten Sands, with each telling a different story. The versions for consoles and PC are largely the same, and pick up the action with the prince being dispatched to train with his brother Malik in the hopes that he will gain some much needed leadership skills. Only when he arrives at Malik's fortress, he discovers it is under siege from an invading force, who are seeking the fabled army of King Solomon. And to make matters worse, when he reunites with his brother, the prince discovers that Malik is hell-bent on unleashing the mythical army to dispel their unwelcome guests. As the prince has experience in dabbling with questionable supernatural forces, he advises against that plan, but Malik ignores him and all hell naturally breaks loose. In the chaos, Malik and the prince both end up with half of the seal that was keeping the army at bay, before they are separated. The prince is whisked into a mystical realm lorded over by a queen jinn called Razia, who lays out the stakes for our hero. It turns out that Solomon's army is actually controlled by an evil jinn called Ratash, who's hellbent on wiping out all of humanity. Razia also reveals that the only way to defeat him is by reuniting the 2 halves of the seal, which quickly becomes a tall order when the prince discovers that his brother is going a little power mad with all the carnage.
If you care nothing for power, let me reunite the seal.
Malik slowly becomes corrupted by the power of the seal, while the prince is protected by his ties to Razia. Long story short, Malik eventually confronts and kills Ratash, only for the jinn to possess Malik and destroy his half of the seal. Razia drops the bad news on the prince, telling him that in order to kill Ratash, he'll have to kill his brother as well.
You mean kill Malik? I won't do that.
And she possesses the prince's sword, ready to take the fight to her jinn counterpart. The prince eventually catches up to Malik/Ratash and successfully defeats the evil pairing, and our young hero mourns his brother as he dies in his arms.
And while this side story doesn't really go any way to filling the gap between the Sands of Time and Warrior Within, it at least gives us some context as to why the prince went through something of a personality change between those 2 games.
Right, things don't end there of course. Remember, there are 4 versions of this game. Let's speed through the remaining trio. For starters, the Wii version runs with a completely different story that sees the prince team up with another djinn to save a magical kingdom for a giant plant. Yeah, it's quite the departure. The PSP version, on the other hand, sees the prince hunt down a murderous fire spirit, while the DS game sees an amnesiac prince kidnapped by a cult who want to utilise the power of Raja for nefarious means. Again, quite the departure from the main storyline. Anyway, before we get into Warrior Within, it's time for something completely different.
Yeah, we're venturing into the world of turn-based tactics with Battles of Prince of Persia, which ties into the wider storyline more than you might think.
Whereas the Forgotten Sands was positioned as the glue between the carefree Prince of the Sands of Time and the tortured soul we see in Warrior Within, a lot of that connective tissue is actually found in Battles of Prince of Persia, which sees our young hero embroiled in a war between Persia, India and the fictional nation of Arasura. In between all the turn-based fighting, the prince is being hunted down by the Dahaka, an ancient demon of sorts who is the literal manifestation of fate. You see, the Dahaka is rightly pretty pissed off for all the timeline meddling that the prince has done in the Sands of Time, and so he's after the prince for time justice or something to that effect. Either way, the Dahaka doesn't catch the prince, or else there would be no Warrior Within. And the prince's involvement within the lengthy wars at least gives us some more context as to why his character has matured somewhat by the events of the next game. Speaking of...
Warrior Within takes the franchise in a much darker direction than the fairy tale fantasy of the Sands of Time, and its story matches that tone as well.
The game kicks off right in the thick of things, with the prince being chased by the fate demon Dahaka. He's on the run for crimes against time, and seeking a backdoor out, he meets with a wise man who tells him about the existence of the Island of Time, which is the supposed birthplace of the Sands. Fast forward to the prince on his merry way to the island aboard a ship, which is suddenly attacked by a giant barge led by a scantily clad woman who will later learn is Shadi, a servant to the Empress of Time. Long story short, the prince's ship is destroyed and he luckily washes up on the shores of the Island of Time. As the prince makes his way through the ruins of the island, he encounters Shadia once again and takes after her in pursuit. This eventually leads him through a portal which sends him back through time to when the Island of Time was in its heyday. In the past, he finds Shadia fighting with another woman who turns out to be Kylina, who is eventually revealed to be the Empress herself. Anyway, the prince intervenes and defeats Shadia in combat before teaming up with a reluctant Kylina to set about fixing his fate and getting the Dahaka off his scent. The Dahaka has other ideas though. And like a giant smoky nemesis, he hunts the prince through the temples and ruins of the Island of Time. He's not the only antagonist after the prince though, as a mysterious sand wraith also hounds our hero as he goes about his mission. The sand wraith gets caught in the Dahaka's warpath and is killed. Don't forget this, it'll come back round to being important shortly. Anyway, the prince finally makes it to the centre of the Island of Time, and Kylina attacks him in order to save her own bacon and keep the prince's fate in check. The prince wins the battle however, but finds that this has done nothing to stop the Dahaka, and it's here that he learns that the death of the Empress actually creates the Sand of Time as a result of his actions.
We're veering dangerously close to the realm of the paradoxical here, but let's continue.
Handily for this exact moment in the plot, the prince discovers a means to change his fate via an artifact known as the Mask of the Wraith, and he formulates a bold plan that sounds crazy in theory and actually, to be honest, is pretty crazy in execution too. He creates a time portal to bring the Empress into the present, which takes her and the Sands out of their current timeline, thus negating their discovery and removal to Azad a la the events of the first game. This sort of works, but the mask turns the prince into the sand wraith we encountered earlier. But the difference here is that we now have two princes knocking about in the present timeline, one normal, one sand flavoured. The sand prince manages to save his own skin by allowing his former self to be taken by the Dahaka, thus apparently sealing the loop on that little time misdemeanor.
The mask. It's loose.
Either way, our bold hero is freed from the Wraith Mask and he takes his place in the present timeline. As Warrior Within barrels towards its balmy conclusion, the prince re-witnesses similar events from earlier in the game, where Shadia and Kylina were fighting. After Shadia is defeated, he then follows Kylina to the throne room and tells her that it is possible to change their fate. Kylina still doesn't believe him however, and the pair fight once again, this time with the Dahaka back in the mix. And here's where Warrior Within's multiple endings come into play. Based on whether you found the Water Sword during your adventures through time, you got one of two different endings. Firstly, without the Water Sword, the prince kills Kylina as per his original plan, which creates the Sands in the present timeline and rewrites all the events from the first game so that they didn't happen at all. The Dahaka sucks up all the time energy and vanishes into thin air. The prince then makes his way off the island and heads home to Babylon, which he discovers is under attack by an invading army, who also happen to have his old flame Farah held hostage. And secondly, the canonical ending with the Water Sword, where the prince is able to fight off the Dahaka and save Kylina, and the pair escape the Island of Time aboard a makeshift boat. Crucially, this ending also wipes away the events of the Sands of Time, which I'll explain in just a second. On their travels to Babylon, the pair get close with one another before arriving at their destination, which as per the first ending sees Babylon up in flames.
Right, we are finally at the climax of the Sands of Time quadrilogy, and the Two Thrones really throws everything back into the mix.
The game kicks off almost immediately in the aftermath of Warrior Within, with the prince and Kylina arriving at Babylon. Only things are a little different now as a result of all of the princes meddling with the timelines. For starters, as the Sands were never discovered in the past by the Vizier and the Maharaja from the first game, the opening of that game has been rewritten, with the Vizier now back alive. But once a wrong'un, always a wrong'un, and it's the Vizier who's at the heart of Babylon's current troubles. As the prince and Kylina wash ashore, Kylina is carried off by the Vizier's men, and when the prince gives chase, he witnesses Kylina's death at the hands of the Vizier, who stabs her with the Dagger of Time and somehow re-releases the Sands all over again. With the Sands wreaking havoc, a lot happens in a short span of time. Firstly, the Vizier stabs himself with the dagger, which supposedly makes him immortal, before throwing the dagger to one side. Meanwhile, the prince, with nothing to protect him, is attacked by the Sands, which coil a nasty looking metal whip into his skin. Seeing the dagger handily nearby, the prince grabs it, which gives him immunity to the Sands, but not before he's been sufficiently infected by the time energy to the point that he now has something of a split personality.
What is
the Vizier done to me?
Yep, say hello to the Dark Prince, a narcissistic, self-serving bastard of a character who plagues the prince as a little devil on his shoulder, but also grants him some wicked sweet new powers to boot. With his dark side hidden in plain sight, the prince struggles through the ruins of Babylon, trying to put things right. On his journey, he comes back into the path of Farah, who has absolutely no memory of him.
See previous mentions of past timeline meddling for reasons why.
The prince, however, is still well acquainted with her and surprises her with the fact that he knows her name, and a lot more besides. The pair strike up an entirely new relationship as they journey through Babylon, but ever the pain in the neck, somewhat literally to be honest, the Dark Prince rears his ugly face to send Farah running for the hills at his terrible personality.
You're one of them?
No, Farah! This is not how it appears!
The prince attempts to suppress his inner demon, but the damage is done. Despite that, the pair finally reunite and head after the evil vizier. They walk straight into his trap, however, and the vizier captures Farah and throws our poor prince down a deep, dark well. Quite literally having hit rock bottom, the prince once again resists the temptations of his dark self, but his resolve is weakened when he comes across the corpse of his father. Picking up his father's old sword, the prince lets the Dark Prince back in as a means to put things right, and the haphazard pairing set off to confront the vizier.
What is this?
And the two thrones comes to a head with the prince killing the vizier with the Dagger of Time, which releases the sands again, thus saving Babylon. The sands then take the shape of Kailina, who tells the prince that his journey is finally over, before she makes for pastures new. Only the prince's journey isn't over, as he's sucked into a mind battle with himself, or the Dark Prince at least. As he battles with his inner demon, the prince struggles to overpower his dark urges, before finally being saved by the voice of Farah, which helps him escape the duel. As he emerges from within his mind, he sets about explaining just how he knows Farah, which triggers a whole fresh retelling of the events of the Sands of Time, and brings this chapter to a close.
Come, and I will tell you a tale like none you have ever heard.
Right, who's got 2 thumbs and is ready to start all over again? This guy.
Okay, so the 2008 reboot of Prince of Persia starts the story completely afresh in a new timeline altogether. For starters, there's no guarantee that the prince of this game is even a real prince. But what this reboot does offer is a brand new world full of rich lore that dates back over 1,000 years. So let's start our story there. In an ancient Persian state, the world is split in a power struggle between the all-powerful gods Ahriman and Ormazd. To keep things simple, Ahriman is a bad lad and Ormazd is literally the god of light. Ormazd and his people win out, and they imprison the evil Ahriman and his minions in a giant sacred tree known as the Tree of Life to cool off for eternity. Only as eternity somewhat ironically comes to an end, the power of Ormazd and his people starts to wane, and Ahriman threatens to break free from his jail. Enter our plucky young prince, voiced by the very much non-Persian Nolan North at the peak of his powers.
Oh no! Oh crap!
Who's looking for his faithful donkey Farah, who despite the name has absolutely no relevance to the plot of this game whatsoever. Instead of finding Farah, the prince bumps into a woman named Elika, who's on the run from a pair of soldiers. After helping her escape, the prince follows Elika to the giant tree jail that lords over the local desert scenery, where he quickly discovers all the bad shit going down. Things turn even further south when Elika's deranged father, the Morning King, turns up spewing nonsense about setting Ahriman free, a feat that he eventually succeeds in pulling off, which sends a thick layer of corruption across the Persian lands. And so the rest of the game becomes a clean-up operation of sorts, as the prince and Elika hot-footed around the map, hoovering up light orbs and purifying the 4 key regions of the land. Thrown into the mix are boss battles with a quartet of Ahriman's chief lieutenants, who are known as the Hunter, the Alchemist, the Warrior and the Concubine respectively, each of whom have dense backstories that you can discover through your interactions with Elika. Speaking of Elika, it turns out that she died just before you met her. Yep, Elika is technically an undead light zombie thing during the events of the game, as it turns out that she was brought to the Tree of Life to be revived by Ahriman by her father before the game kicked off, which explains why she has all these fancy new light powers. Anyway, once the prince and Elika purify the 4 key biomes, they return to the Tree of Life where they encounter the Morning King once again. After they defeat him in battle, he throws himself into Ahriman's pit, and the old god returns with a vengeance. In the heat of the ensuing battle, Elika sacrifices herself to seal the evil bastard away for good, leaving the prince to mourn his new partner. However, the prince has fallen head over heels for Elika to the point where he can't accept her death, so he doesn't. He traipses back through the 4 regions, destroying the 4 fertile grounds as he goes, and then he returns to the Tree of Life to make the same deal that Elika's father made before the beginning of the game. There he destroys the tree itself and returns the light power that was sealing Ahriman away back into Elika's body, which brings her back to life.
Why?
And the game ends with the prince carrying Elika's revived body across the desert as Ahriman and his minions start to tear the kingdom apart. Only that's not actually the end, as the story continues in a further DLC expansion simply titled The Epilogue. Here, Elika awakes from her deathly slumber and is absolutely pissed at the prince for unleashing evil on the world just for the sake of their relationship.
Okay, so you're angry.
The prince argues in his own defense, stating that at least they still have a chance of ridding the world of Ahriman once and for all. And well, we never find out whether they complete that mission, as the epilogue ends on a rather downbeat note, with Elika leaving to go and find her people, while the prince has to deal with the murderous Ahriman.
However, there is some closure to this branch of the Prince of Persia mythos in the sequel Prince of Persia: The Fallen King, which came out on the DS on the same day as its console big brother.
Here we join the prince on another adventure to a separate kingdom where he's seeking to make amends for unleashing evil upon the known world by summoning the light power of Ormaz. Instead, he gets drawn into another fight against the corrupt forces of Ahriman, alongside a new ally called Zal. Long story short, this new pairing thwarts the corruption tearing through the kingdom, but at the cost of Zal's life. But at least the game ends on a note of hope for the prince, as he chats with a mysterious character known as the Ancestor, who tells him that he will eventually find an inner power to conquer his demons.
And so all of this finally brings us to Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, which reboots the franchise once again within a whole new world, albeit with a Metroidvania twist. And if you are yet to play The Lost Crown, consider this your spoiler warning.
Here we meet a brand new hero named Sargon, who's part of a mythical superhero squad named the Immortals. Along with the rest of the Immortals, Sargon travels to Mount Kaf, which is plagued by bizarre time anomalies, en route to rescuing the kidnapped son of the Queen of Persia, i.e. the Prince of Persia. Said Prince Hassan has been kidnapped by a rogue member of the Immortals, Sargon's mentor Anahita, before he's shockingly murdered by Varan, the head of the Immortals, who's got his eye on the throne. Yep, I'm thinking the Immortals aren't the all-singing, all-dancing superhero group they claim to be. Anyway, due to those aforementioned time anomalies, Sargon discovers a loophole to save Hassan from his fate by entering into a time bubble of sorts to save the Prince of Persia. And to keep things vague so as to not overly spoil things, the game's just come out as of the release of this video, Sargon ventures around the labyrinth on Mount Kaf, fighting monsters and waking up ancient constellations, en route to a final showdown with Varan and his old teammates.
And that, my friends, is the Prince of Persia timeline, or timelines I guess, fully explained. If you like these kinds of gaming timeline videos, we've got plenty more on the channel right now, including Metroid, Silent Hill and Zelda. Thanks a lot for watching guys, I'll see you next time.